writing his dissertation on the theology of apostographic friendship in Maximus the Confessor. His paper, The Rejuvenating Reception of Nicaea in Maximus the Confessor's Apostle 14, examined the dogmatic apostle of Maximus in light of Mark Smith's claim that the idea of Nicaea was received in apostolic reformulation in which the past is constantly received afresh in the present, in a process of rejuvenating reception that cannot be reduced to a specific historical moment. Please join me in listening to the video of Son Yan Jong.
Your Excellency, Prime Minister Barzani of Kurdistan, Your Holinesses Ma Awa III and Ma Georgis III Yunan, Your Beatitude and Eminence, Cardinal Sacco, ladies and gentlemen, what a great honor it is to be able to present in front of such an august audience today, albeit virtually. And I want to thank Dahlia and the team for working very hard to organize this conference. And my special gratitude goes to Professor Erica Hunter for introducing me to this conference, to such an important opportunity to celebrate the 1700th anniversary of Nicaea in Erbil. This paper will examine the so-called dogmatic epistle, probably written in the year 633 or early 634, written by Maximus the Confessor. And I want to examine this epistle in light of Mark Smith's claim in his book that the idea of Nicaea was received in episodic reformulations in which the past is constantly re-received afresh in the present, in a process of rejuvenating reception that cannot be reduced to a historical moment. The tumultuous 5th century Christological controversies had led all parties to receive Nicaea as the sufficient standard for the faith, whilst also supplementing it for a fresh context. By the 7th century, such fraught Christological questions had persisted despite Justinian's attempt to unify the imperial church at the start, beginning of the 6th century, mid-6th century, and had, if anything, been accentuated by the apocalyptic hype of the Persian, then Islamic conquests of vast swaths of the Byzantine world. Sort of key points here are the siege of Constantinople in 626, Heraclius' victory in 628, and the Battle of Yarmouk in the year 636, which caused great apocalyptic fervor in the period and led to an accentuation and intensification of the existing Christological controversies. At stake in this paper is the question of whether the reception of Nicaea changes after the Christological divisions of the 5th century have been institutionalized. So Mark Smith's book answers the question of whether the reception of Nicaea, that the Christological divisions of the theoretical Christological divisions of the 5th century were fundamentally related to a rejuvenating reception of Nicaea, whereas my paper will examine what happens, is there still this same type of reception of Nicaea, rejuvenating reception of Nicaea in a period once the Christological divisions have been institutionalized. And the key is specifically with the alternative Miaphysite hierarchy, since Jacob Baradaeus was consecrated in the mid-6th century. This paper will argue that Maximus's dogmatic epistle shows that polemicists of both Chalcedonian and anti-Chalcedonian communities still looked to the proper reception of Nicaea as the measure of orthodoxy, even when they held a more recent ecumenical council in common. I think a key point at which we should examine the dynamic and fluid character of the different communities is precisely in the union in Alexandria, the attempted union in the year 633. Following Heraclius's monumental victory over the Persians and his restoration of the True Cross in the year 628, the imperial religious policy aimed to reconcile with Miaphysite communities which were perceived as having the potential to foment division in periods of war. For Heraclius, these divisions would have become all the more plausible as the Persian Shah, Khosrow II, had attempted to exploit the religious divisions of formerly Byzantine subjects. Given that the Church of the East had already been established in its center in Ctesiphon, Seleucia from at least the Synod of 410, and had increasingly isolated itself from Byzantine theology in the period that, according to Sebastian Brock, proved formative for the Christological position of the Church of the East, the Heraclian religious policy prioritized reconciliation with the Miaphysite hierarchy. Nonetheless, I think the key insights of this period, specifically the fluid and dynamic character of the Chalcedonian with non-Chalcedonian communities, tells us great lessons about ecumenical relations between the Church of the East and Chalcedonian communities, as well as between, for modern contemporary questions of ecumenical dialogue as well. So it was through the Patriarch Sergius that the imperial religious policy promulgated monoenergism, the doctrine that Christ has a single theandric activity, energeia, and on this ostensibly Dionysian basis, a union was reached with the Theodosians, who are the main Miaphysite group of Alexandria in the year 633. So, Maximus the Confessor. Well, Maximus the Confessor, who would become the most important Diophysite Chalcedonian defender of Dioenergism and Diotheletism, wrote an important dogmatic epistle in this context, and the Pact of Union in 633 that had been promulgated in Alexandria proves the complex context to this dogmatic epistle. Although it has already been analyzed for development of his Christological thought, very little scholarly attention has been given to Maximus's account of the deacon Cosmas, the letter-bearer's conversion, apparently from Miaphysite communities in his epistle. A key question, I think, that ought to be asked is, how is the boundary between Miaphysite and Chalcedonian communities understood? And what are the implications of this understanding for analyzing relations between Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian communities throughout this period? What was the so-called confession of faith that Cosmas had to undertake for his reception into communion with Maximus and his allies? Such questions merit exploration when reading and rereading Epistle 14, because answers to these would elucidate how the differences between churches was understood in the first generations after the institutionalization of the Christological divisions, and provide cues for contemporary ecumenical dialogue. Furthermore, if my claim is correct, and Maximus's reception of Cosmas's profession of faith, homologia, refers primarily to his correct interpretation of Nicaea, this would suggest that still in the 7th century, Christological doctrines were understood as a negation of incorrect understandings of Nicaea, rather than subscribing to a series of positive claims formulated at Ephesus or Chalcedon, for example. By the 7th century, the centrality of Nicaea had been established for the vast majority of the Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian communities in the East. For the Church of the East in particular, to whom this august conference is dedicated, the Synod of Seleucia Ctesiphon in the year 410 officially recognized Nicaea as, quote, our confession and our faith, which have been received from our holy fathers. As Sebastian Brock has convincingly argued, even Catholicos Abba the Great, who brought Nestorius's writings to Persia, so in the Church of the East, Nestorius is, of course, venerated, but is not the most. I mean, Theodore is clearly more important in many ways. And yet, Catholicos Abba the Great, who brought Nestorius's writings to Persia, who we would expect to be, if anything, more partisan towards Nestorius's writings himself, is, quote, surprisingly traditional in theological language for his contributions to his synod in the year 544, and the profession of faith perhaps deliberately avoids any of the contentious technical terms. Whereas Chalcedonian communities would later present the formation of the Church of the East in a conscious rejection of Ephesus, 431, and Chalcedon, 451, in this kind of heresiological account from the Chalcedonian perspective, the political and hierarchical separation of the Church of the East from the Council of Ctesiphon Seleucia in the year 410 tells a different story. Already chronologically, the division was happening much earlier from a cultural political perspective, and the Christological divisions only accentuated such divides. The key then is that whilst there was interdenominational disagreement after Chalcedon, this was often over the reception of Nicaea, which, as Mark Smith has noted, had become a kind of shibboleth of orthodoxy for both Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian communities. Indeed, to quote him directly, the discursive flexibility of Nicene tropes allowed every position to claim Nicaea's mantle as its own and to be read into the simple wording of the creed in its particular doctrinal idiosyncrasies. This context prompts us to ask what precisely is meant when Maximus says, the above-mentioned God-loving Lord Cosmas, having gladly accepted this profession of faith, homologian, I have also accepted him, rejoicing, and being aware of his simple disposition according to Christ. I have preferred him over my own soul. What precisely is the nature of this homologia? Writing to Peter the Illustrious to recommend the deacon Cosmas, apparently a recent convert from moderate, perhaps Severan Miaphysitism, to the Patriarch of Alexandria for ordination, ostensibly Maximus has accepted a confession in accordance with the Chalcedonian definition. I mean, that's what we would expect, that he's coming from a Miaphysite community, accept the definition of the Diophysite definition of Chalcedon. And yet a careful reading of the letter without reifying the emphasis on the Chalcedonian definition suggests that what was still at stake in the 7th, as in the 5th century, if we follow Mark Smith's account, was the correct reception of Nicaea. There are three main reasons for this reading. Firstly, intellectually, Cosmas is presented as not denying those things that Christ is after the ineffable union. Secondly, Maximus omits a range of possible Miaphysite views in his condemnation of Apollinaris and Nestorius. Directly quoting, Apollinaris and Nestorius are the only two that are condemned, rather than the vast swaths of contemporary Miaphysite possibilities that he could have condemned, and Maximus well does in other letters. Finally, morally, Cosmas is presented as being simple. So to take the first point first, when Maximus first describes Cosmas's acceptance of the pious teachings of the divine dogmas of the Church, ton ephsevi, ton theon, tis ecclesias dogmaton, prosikatologon, rather peculiarly, he emphasizes that Cosmas knows not to deny tomiden nisthe phronin, those things that Christ is after the ineffable union. Maximus apparently takes Cosmas's acceptance of the Church's teachings as the same as simply not to deny the Chalcedonian position on the most contentious Christological position that appears to have been at stake. Secondly, this is further peculiar that given Cosmas's conversion apparently from a Miaphysite community, Maximus's articulation of the faith that makes the bulk of his letter only denounces the, quote, confusion of Apollinaris and, quote, the division of Nestorius. Unlike other Maximian polemics, he seems very comfortable elsewhere against writing against Eutyches and Severus and contemporary Miaphysites, Maximus clearly was not unaware of the range of Miaphysite views and thinkers, yet the way he presents his nice reception of Cosmas's profession of faith suggests that he merely needed to reject Apollinaris and Nestorius, whom he probably already had rejected anyway. Finally, this apparent omission of the range of other Monophysite heretics that Maximus engages elsewhere is related to the claim Maximus makes that he was glad to receive Cosmas's profession, knowing his simple disposition according to Christ, hina plin aftu kata Christon diathesin gnus. It is as though for Maximus, Cosmas is praiseworthy for accepting a form of the faith that is more simple, haplin, compared to the complexity of other communities' professions of faith. In the tumultuous period of the Pact of Union in Alexandria, Maximus presents Cosmas's conversion as intimately connected to his simple disposition with reference to Christ, with only a minimal renunciation of the doctrines of the Miaphysite divines and a profession of faith resembling the Nicene Creed, with few additions and clarifications. Therefore, whilst examining Maximus's letters for Christological content pertinent to his later rejection of the imperial policy of monoenergism and monothelitism can be valuable, monoenergism beginning with the Zephos of 633, monothelitism with the Ekthesis of 638, scholars should be wary of reifying and reading later Christological controversies into Maximus's earlier epistolography, and more work needs to be done on the letters. And this is something I'm dedicating my doctorate to at the moment. I have a translation of Maximus's letters in my laptop in English, the first one, and not yet translated. And I'm working precisely on this problem. Phil Booth's Crisis of Empire, the book, has undoubtedly advanced scholarship in this respect by emphasizing the profound continuity between Maximus's early ascetic works and his later Christological polemical works, by showing profound influence of John of Damascus and Sophronius of Jerusalem on Maximus's worldview. However, instead of increased doctrinal exclusivity with the rise of the Eucharist as an ecclesio-political boundary marker for Christian communities, as Phil Booth claims, I believe that the Pact of Union in the year 633 represents a more fluid and dynamic moment in which at least some Christians revered simplicity, a rejuvenated reception of a mere Christianity as represented in Nicaea. Nicaea, in this sense, became a kind of symbol for a kind of mere Christianity, which was simple and could be glorified as a kind of gold standard for the faith, for all parties involved. It was a kind of ecumenical movement, an ecumenical moment, we might be able to say. Furthermore, scholars should read Maximus's doctrinal statements in his letters with greater sensitivity to genre, especially his advancements in the studies of Byzantine epistolography, especially with the Brill Handbook for Byzantine Epistolography, published some 4 years ago by Alex Freeler, have not yet yielded any monograph-length treatment of Maximus's letters, again, what I'm dedicating my doctorate to, let alone an English translation of the epistolary corpus. For instance, the Christological affirmations in Epistle 14 cannot be fully appreciated without the extended epistolary greeting, which culminates with the greatest of all goods is the union, henosis, of the people who are separated according to faith, because it has set in order the visible work of God. Can the term henosis in the greeting of such a Christologically oriented letter, where we've discussed the ineffable union, henosis, be a coincidence when the whole point is that the Christological letter be separated from the aforementioned claim that Cosmas knows not to deny those things that Christ is after the ineffable union? My point is that Christology and sacramentology and ecclesiology are intimately connected through the medium of the letter itself. In her pivotal book, Jewish Christianity and the History of Judaism, Annette Yoshiko Reed has problematized the parting of the ways narrative between Judaism and Christianity as overly simplistic, as marginalizing the texts groups, and figures that complicate commonplace assumptions about Christianity's so-called parting of the ways from Judaism. Reed astutely notes that the overlaps between Judaism and Christianity remain notable enough into late antiquity that it is impossible to pinpoint any single decisive or irreversible moment at which the study of Jewish sources and self-definition becomes globally irrelevant for understanding Christian sources and self-definition. My central claim in this paper is that, as with Jewish Christianity, moments such as the Pact of Union complicate the relationship between Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian communities well into the 7th and later centuries. It is impossible to pinpoint any moment at which the study of Chalcedonian sources become irrelevant for the study of non-Chalcedonian communities. This is because the original sufficiency and necessary supplementation to Nicaea in the 5th century Christological controversies does not self-evidently change in the 7th century, and the apparently minimal affirmation of Nicaea in simplicity is apparently all it took for Maximus to accept the deacon from the Monophysite community. Therefore, the 17th centenary of Nicaea provides scholars and ecclesiastics of all denominations to reconsider the controversies persisting into the 7th century as much a hermeneutical reception of Nicaea as a Christological problem. Many patrologists and council historians have reified divisions between Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian communities, sometimes even in the early period, in the 5th century. To paraphrase Reed, however, there is a case to be made for experimenting with rereading some Chalcedonian sources as evidence for the Church of the East history, even into the 7th century and beyond, extending the same trends that Smith has shown for the 5th century, and vice versa as well, for Chalcedonian scholars of Chalcedonian Christianity to look into the Church of the East sources to be able to examine the fluid and dynamic character of Christianity, which has persisted and should well persist even to this present day. And the anniversary of Nicaea is the perfect impetus for such a dialogue, and indeed the perfect continuation of letters such as Epistle 14, the search for Christian simplicity in the midst of Nicaea and her reception. Thank you very much.
I ask our speakers to come here, please. We start with Professor Hubert Kaufhold. He was born in 1943 in Germany, specializes in law, philology of the Christian Orient, canon law, and Syriac studies. He has held the title of honorary professor since 1986. Throughout his distinguished career, Professor Kaufhold has been the recipient of numerous honors and distinctions. He is the author or editor of 16 books and has published over 90 scholarly articles and 200 book reviews. His paper for today, The Reception of the Canon of Nicaea by the East Syrians, explores how the 20 canons issued as the Council of Nicaea were received by the East Syrian Church. While these authentic Nicene canons were known, East Syrian sources often relied more heavily on a large set of 73 pseudo-Nicene canons, which became more influential in their ecclesiastical law. Key figures like Bishop Marutha and later compilations in Syriac and Arabic facilitated the transmission of these texts. Ultimately, the paper shows that the pseudo-Nicene canons hold greater practical significance than the original Nicene canons in the East Syrian tradition. Professor, we are honored to have you here.
What have I to do here?
Yes.
That's
just have to move this.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, at the Council of Nicaea, not only were fundamental matters of faith discussed and a creed established, but 20 canonical regulations were also enacted. These canons are found in the canonical collections of all churches, both Eastern and Western. The transmission of these canons to the East Syrians is a subject addressed by several sources, though not without ambiguity. A key figure in this process was Bishop Marutha of Maiferkat, a city within Roman territory at the Persian border. Marutha played a significant role. He was involved in negotiations between the Byzantines and the Persians and is believed to have traveled to Persia twice. During his second visit in 410, the canons of Nicaea were among the matters under discussion. The acts of the Synod of Seleucia-Ctesiphon, which took place in 410 under the Metropolitan or Grand Metropolitan or Catholicos Isaac, report the following. Several bishops of the Antiochian Church province had written a letter to Marutha, which he was to deliver to the Persian king. On the occasion of his visit to Seleucia, a synod of 40 East Syrian bishops was held. During the synod, the letter was read aloud and its contents recorded in the Acts. Professor Winkler also told about this. The first part of the letter states that there should be only one bishop per city and that a new bishop must be consecrated by 3 bishops, an issue also addressed in Canon 4 of Nicaea. The second part discusses which feasts should be celebrated, corresponding to Canon 6 to 8 of the pseudo-apostolic teaching of the apostles. In the third part, the Western bishops declare that whenever a synod is held in the East, they would send all the decreed canons established at the Great Synod of Nicaea. Strangely, the report immediately continues by stating that Isaac said to Marutha, "Bring forth that volume in which the canons are written, that it may be read before the entire synod." It remains unclear what canons the Western bishops intended to send and what exactly was contained in the volume that was read in the synod. Among the East Syrians, not only the 20 authentic canons of Nicaea have been transmitted in Syriac, but also 73 additional canons, which are likewise attributed to the Synod of Nicaea as the canons of the 318 Fathers. Notably, these also appear in Arabic among the Melkines, Maronites, and Copts, albeit in varying versions. In these traditions, there are a total of 84 canons, of which the first 32 are absent in the Syriac collections, and additional 15 and 19 canons are appended. The correspondence can be seen in Table 1. I hope it is, yes. Back. Yes. Ist nicht ganz, aber ist egal jetzt. 2 independent Melkite texts containing 15 and 19 canons, respectively, corresponding to Syriac canons 48 to 73, are closely associated with Nicaea in Arabic manuscripts. Their titles read Regulations and Provisions of the same 318 Holy Fathers who gathered in Nicaea concerning monks and anchorites. And the second, various other ecclesiastical provisions of the same 318 Holy Fathers. Evidently, these were transmitted to the East and immediately appended to the other canons. The content of these canons concern a wide range of topics, including regulations for clergy, bishops, marriage, the reception of heretics, church organization, synods, liturgy, and monastic life, among others. It is assumed that the Arabic text was translated from Greek. The Syriac version was also likely translated directly from Greek. Both versions independently derive from a common Vorlage, which underwent various modifications. It does not appear that the canons the Antiochian bishops intended to send were the authentic 20 canons of Nicaea. These must have already been known to Marutha, who could have brought them himself. Instead, it seems to have been a larger collection, perhaps the Greek original of the Arabic canons, which has not been preserved. The presence of these canons among both the Melkites and the East Syrians is striking. After the Christological controversies of the 5th century, it would have been highly unlikely for the East Syrians to adopt them. The 84 Arabic canons present themselves as a unified work. The reason for the absence of canons 1 to 32 in Syriac among the East Syrians remained unresolved until now. Further insight may be gained from an Arabic compilation of Western and Eastern synods authored by the East Syrian Metropolitan Elias al-Jauhari at the end of the 9th century. Notably, he explicitly states that his work is based on a Syriac collection, and that is important. His Vorlage was a Syriac collection. The title of his work reads, I quote, "This is what Elias, Metropolitan of Damascus, has explained, Fasarahu in Arabic, by translating it from Syriac into Arabic, namely the book called in Greek Synados, which means the luminous assembly. For our inquiry, it is significant that Elias first presents 30 canons of Nicaea. Their title reads, from the regulations set by the 318 fathers, called in Greek Synodikon, meaning luminous assembly. This is not a direct rendering of the 20 authentic canons, but rather corresponds largely to canons 3 to 32 of the Melkite 84 Arabic canons. Since Elias al-Jauhari used a Syriac Vorlage, it is evident that a Syriac translation of this text once existed, but has since been lost. The correspondences can be observed in Table 2. Let's see what it is. Yes, you can see the Arabic canons, and in the last line you have the Elias al-Jauhari, and you can see, especially from 22 to the end, that is exactly the same content in these canons. The first two Arabic canons are absent in Elias al-Jauhari's work. The source is not the canons of Nicaea, but pseudo-apostolic canons, likely later additions. In addition to the Nicene canons, there are 11 other provisions of mostly unknown origin. These in particular demonstrate that Elias al-Jawhari's compilation and the Arabic canons share the same content. Minor variations in numbering are not important, as different textual witnesses sometimes divide canons into multiple numbers or merge multiple canons under a single number. According to the Syriac text and Elias al-Jawhari, the entire text consists of two parts. That is the first one. Yes, here, the two parts. You can see it better on this, on the right side. This is a simplified version. The first part contained canon 1 to 30, which are not preserved in Syriac, while the second part includes the newly numbered canons 1 to 74 or 1 to 73 in Syriac. The order of the canons in Elias al-Jawhari and in the Syriac text differs slightly. The second part in Elias al-Jawhari has its own heading. I quote, "These are the fundamental provisions to which the leaders and the people adhere, compiled by the Easterners and the Westerners. There are 74 provisions." Some of the 33 of the 73 or 74 canons, namely the Greek Vorlage, appear to have drawn upon the canons of Nicaea, Antioch, Laodicea, and Chalcedon. Thus, the two parts originally do not seem to have constituted a unified text. The Arabic canons divide differently. The first part comprises 84 canons, while the second and third part, which are based on two other works, are renumbered, each beginning again with canon 1. In the first part of the Arabic canons, canons 1 to 30, according to the numbering of Elias al-Jawhari, almost all Nicene canons appear, albeit in a somewhat different order as indicated in the next table. I hope I can. Yes, you can see that almost all Nicene canons are in this collection. Canons 1 and 12 to 14 of Nicaea are omitted. The Nicene canons are supplemented by additional provisions, canons 20 to 29 of Elias al-Jawhari. The final canon 30 corresponds to the last authentic canon 20 of Nicaea. The following conclusions can be drawn from this finding. It is probable that the East Syrians originally possessed a Syriac chronological synodal collection that included both 30 and 74 or 73 Nicene canons. The now lost 30 Syriac canons likely corresponded to those found in the collection of Elias al-Jawhari. Elias al-Jawhari appears to have derived these two texts from the original Syriac collection. However, he extensively revised both the 30 and 73 canons, making it difficult to reconstruct their Syriac Vorlage. Later, the Syriac chronological collection was significantly expanded, and instead of the 30 Arabic canons, the first part, the 20 authentic Nicene canons in Syriac were placed at the beginning, probably because they were considered, rightly, to be more authentic. The 30 Arabic canons, which largely also reproduced Nicene canons, were now redundant and could be omitted, especially since they had been expanded with additional non-Nicene provisions. It is certainly no coincidence that precisely Canon 1 to 32 and of the Arabic canons, which end with the translation of the 20th and last of the authentic canons, are now missing among the East Syrians, and that Canon 1 of the preserved Syriac text begins with Canon 1 of the second part of Elias al-Jawhari's collection. Thus, at the end of the 9th century, Elias al-Jawhari used an earlier Syriac synodos, a compilation of synodical decrees, which is no longer extant. When this earlier canonical collection was assembled, it appears that a Syriac translation of the authentic Nicene canons were not yet available to the compiler. The authentic canons of the Council of Nicaea, along with these of the other Greek synods, were translated into Syriac in 501 or 2 of the Christian era. The earliest extant manuscripts witness to this translation is British Library 14,528, which dates to the early 6th century. The precise date of the translation's arrival at the East remains uncertain. However, it must have occurred prior to 543 the Christian areas, as these Greek canons were already accessible to the Synod of Ma'ava. The introduction to the canons promulgated by this synod explicitly acknowledges their reliance to the canons of several early Greek councils, including those of Nicaea, Ancyraneo, Caesarea, Gangra, Antioch, Laodicea, and Chalcedon. This suggests that the synod had direct access to the texts of these councils, most likely through the Syriac translation produced in 501. This Syriac translation of the Greek canons is contained in the only preserved East Syriac chronological collection, the famous manuscript Notre Dame de Semence 169. This manuscript serves as a textual witness to the revised and expanded synodical collection. The collection used by Elias al-Jawhari exhibits significant similarities to the compilation found in manuscript Notre Dame de Semence 169. Both begin with the pseudo-apostolic canons and then followed other canons. I must be short here. The Synod of Isaac in 410 must have already been aware of the authentic Nicene canons. It issued 21 canons, some of which correspond in content to the authentic Nicene canons and explicitly reference the council. Here. However, it remains uncertain whether a Syriac translation of the Nicene canons were available to them at that time. In summary, the East Syrian sources first mention the canons of the Synod of Nicaea in the early 5th century, specifically in the Acts of the Synod of the Catholicos Isaac in 410. However, it is unclear which canons are meant, as the East Syrians were also familiar with pseudo-Nicene canons of the 318 Fathers. These pseudo-Nicene canons also appear among the Melkites, where they are preceded by 30 other canons for which no Syriac text is extant. The Arabic collection of the East Syrian Elias al-Jawhari from the late 9th century, based on a Syriac Vorlage, does not know the authentic Nicene canons, but only the pseudo-Nicene canons, including the preceding 30 canons. So there must have been a Syriac version of these 30 canons too, which has not been preserved. The authentic Nicene canons and other early synods were not translated into Syriac until the early 6th century, and were transmitted in a later extensive Syriac legal collection of the East Syrians instead of the 30 pseudo-Nicene canons. The pseudo-Nicene canons initially played a greater role than the authentic Nicene canons. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your detailed presentation. Our third and last speaker for today is Dr. Philip Forens, is currently Associate Professor of Eastern Christianity in Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at the Catholic University of Leuven, Belgium, since 2022. His research focuses on the theology, literature, and history of Eastern Christianity, with a particular emphasis on the sermons, translations, and theology poetry of the Syriac Christian tradition. He is the author of 2 books on Jacob of Saruj, published in 2018 and 2022. He also published 2 volumes with English translation of the Syriac version of 1 and 2nd Maccabees, accompanied by extended cultural historical introductions. His paper, The Council of Nicaea in the Historiographic Writings of the Church of the East, will examine how the Church of the East remembered the Council of Nicaea through 10 historical sources. It highlights how these writings shaped the Church's identity and its relationship with other Christian traditions, offering a unique view of Nicaea's legacy outside the Roman Empire. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'd also like to extend, as many others have done, their thanks to the organizers for the chance to be here at this exciting and also, I think, quite innovative conference this year, in which there are so many conferences on Nicaea. I think there's really a distinct contribution here. We've been focusing the last couple days on many different types of texts, looking at the sources from Nicaea itself, other 4th century sources, the Syriac translations from Nicaea, and also looking at its reception, especially in works, synodical documents, and other theological texts. I'd like to focus in my presentation on a different genre of text, historiographical writings. This might not be the best text to give us an idea of how Nicaea was received in the Church of the East, but it gives us a certain perspective on how this council was remembered and what importance it had as this community constructed its own history in relation to other churches. In my presentation, after introducing the corpus under examination, I'll consider how these sources, these historiographical writings, frame the council, then which actors surface in their retelling of the council, and finally how they present the theology of Nicaea. These 3 aspects, I'll argue, when taken together, show how East Syriac historiographies memorialize the Council of Nicaea as both decidedly ecumenical and emphatically local. They accept the universal importance of the council without losing sight of the particular relevance it held for their community. The identification of the 9 texts under investigation, which you'll see listed on the screen, deserves comment. In her magnum opus on the Syriac historiographic tradition from 2015, Muriel Debier provides a comprehensive list of East Syriac historiographies in both Syriac and Arabic. She notes which periods each work covers. 9 of the 11 works, which cover the 4th century, so there are 2 that do not, discuss the Council of Nicaea. So these are the 9 works on the screen. What was formerly known as the Documentum Nestorianum, or the fragment on the conflicts in the Western Church, written sometime after the mid-5th century, Barhad Bashaba Arbaya's ecclesiastical history from the 6th century, the Chronicle of Arbala, a debated work, perhaps 6th century in its origin. Then the history of Karka de Beth Soloch, probably from the later 6th century. John Bar Penkaye's History of the Temporal World from the late 7th century. Elias of Nisibis's Chronicle from 1018 or 1019. The Chronicle of Sirt from perhaps the late 10th or the early 11th century. Amr ibn Mata's History of the Patriarchs of the Church of the East from the 11th century. And Saliba ibn Yohanna's Books of the Mysteries from the 1330s. In this work, Nicaea surfaces in 3 different places, but I'll only focus on the historiographic report given there. The discussions of Nicaea in these works range from a mere 3 lines of text to extended expositions that stretch to 10 pages. So it's quite a range, and they're not really all of the same genre. There are a number of possibilities for investigating Nicaea in these sources. One could take a source-critical approach and examine the interdependency of the historiographies. This might help reveal the origins of particular emphases in the corpus and perhaps lead to a genealogical understanding of the reports of the remembrance of Nicaea. Yet for the purposes of this presentation, I've chosen to consider which themes emerge as one surveys the corpus as a whole. I hope in this way to lay the groundwork for other investigations of the corpus with a more focused approach on a smaller selection of the sources. So first, the framing. The manner in which East Syriac historiographies integrate their account of the Council of Nicaea forms one method for investigating how these sources memorialize the council. All but 2 of the 9 accounts connect the council to the broader history of Christianity in the Roman and/or Persian empires. I'll begin with the sources focused on the Roman Empire and conclude with those more closely tied to the Persian Empire. We'll begin with the fragment on the conflicts in the Western Church. In this source, the Council of Nicaea is framed as a Roman event. The text leading up to the Council of Nicaea discusses Constantine's turn towards Christianity, the dispute between Alexander and Arius, and Constantine's effort to mediate through sending Osius of Cordoba. The conflict, as represented in the fragment, grew larger when the bishops of Libya and Egypt had anathematized Arius, when the party of Eusebius of Nicomedia accepted him. When, as the fragment reads, the emperor heard of these disruptions, he immediately sent at once for an ecumenical synod to be gathered. Immediately following the account of the council, the fragment returns to the history of the Roman Church, enumerating the bishops of the 5 major sees within the Roman Empire. A similarly, exclusively Roman perspective surfaces in other sources, such as the ecclesiastical history of Barhad Bashaba Arbaya and Saliba's Book of the Mysteries. A different framing with an emphasis on the Sasanian Persian Empire. A different framing with an emphasis on the Sasanian Persian Empire appears in other sources. The Chronicle of Arbala portrays the events surrounding Nicaea as a fall from the ideal conditions created for Christianity to flourish within the Roman Empire. Yet directly following the account of Nicaea, it turns to the Persian context. And I quote, "At that time, Shapur II, emperor of the Persians, went to the high mountains to destroy the enemies who were in the high mountains near the sea. Everyone could calculate the time when the churches would be destroyed and the holy places profaned was near." The chronicle juxtaposes the affairs in the Roman Empire that were resolved by Nicaea with the continued troubles of the Christian communities in Persia. A similar framing to this with the Persian emphasis, with almost no mention of the Roman Empire, appears in the history of Amr ibn Mata. Finally, 2 historiographies move beyond a mere juxtaposition of the Roman and Persian events surrounding the council and interweave them. In his History of the Temporal World, John Bar Penkaye describes the situation before Constantine as follows. He writes, "For from the east the sword of the Magians was sharpened against us, and from the west that of the Romans." He then contrasts Constantine's faithful reign with, I quote, "the things that the Magian Shapur dared to do against the faithful in his territory." Before turning back to the Roman affairs that led to the council, Bar Penkaye mentions how the church of Kohe, or Seleucia Ctesiphon, was given the patriarchal throne a little before this time. After the account of the council, the history quickly turns to Julian's reign. The interweaving of Roman and Persian events in the framing of Nicaea can be found to a lesser extent also in the Chronicle of Sirte, where the emperors Diocletian and Maximian are said to have resembled Shapur in what they did to the Christians. The Chronicle likewise inserts a short discussion of the Sasanian Emperor Khosrow II when discussing Helena's discovery of the true cross. In sum, taken as a whole, the framing of the Council of Nicaea in East Syriac historiographies is at once universal and local. All 7 texts that provide a historical frame for the council mention some of the events in the Roman Empire that led to the council. Others contrast the Roman reality to the memory of persecution in Persia under Shapur. These 2 perspectives come together in an integrated way in the Chronicle of Sirte, and especially in Bar Penkaye's history. In addition to the framing of the council in terms of external affairs, the source's identification of key actors involved offers insights into their perspective on Nicaea. There's great variation here in the sources, some of which even omit those normally regarded as the central personalities. Here I will move again from sources primarily focused on Rome to those with an interest in Persia. A number of sources identify the major actors in the council in a way indistinguishable from an account written by other ecclesial communities. An excellent example of this is Elias of Nisibis's Chronicle, where the entire entry related to Nicaea reads as follows. Year 636, from the ecclesiastical history of Socrates, in which the synod of 318 bishops gathered in the city of Nicaea and anathematized the wicked Arius, in which Constantine appointed his son Constantius as emperor over the East. Apparently relying on Socrates, Elias only touches on figures from the Roman Empire in his brief entry. The list of actors in the council's affairs is more expansive in a number of other sources, which nevertheless maintain a focus on the Roman Empire. The fragment names Constantine, Alexander, and Arius, but also includes a list of further figures condemned by the council. The Chronicle of Arbela only mentions Constantine, and Bar Penkaye only Constantine and the Arians. Yet other sources draw attention to the connections with what was or would become the Church of the East. The history of Karka de Beth Solok provides an excellent example. Its entire account of Nicaea reads as follows. John, that is, the bishop of Karka de Beth Solok, succeeded him, the one who, along with Mar Jacob, bishop of Nisibis, and John, bishop of Arbela, shone at the Holy Council of the 318. Nicaea only surfaces here because of the claim that the bishop of Karka de Beth Solok attended it. With its focus on local matters, the history grants short shrift to Nicaea, only mentioning it in relation to the activities of an ecclesiastical leader from a local setting. The remaining 4 historiographies both incorporate the major Roman actors and discuss the participation of Persian bishops. In his ecclesiastical history, Barhad Bashaba cites Constantine letters inviting bishops to Nicaea and offers 2 explanations for why Simeon bar Sabaye, bishop of Seleucia Ctesiphon, chose not to come despite receiving an invitation. Therefore, we read that Simeon bar Sabaye sent a letter through John, bishop of Arbela, and Shahdost, his priest. He sent to the emperor as follows. If the pagans were not thirsting for our blood, I would want to come and be blessed by your royalty and by our faithful fathers and leaders. But I also assent with joy to everything that the whole group of our fathers does, who have been persecuted for the sake of the true faith. After this point, the remainder of Bar Hadbashaba's account is tied to the principal Roman actors. The Chronicle of Siirt, along with the works of Amr and Saliba, likewise discuss the attendance of ecclesiastical figures with strong ties to the Church of the East. In contrast to Bar Hadbashaba, all three report that Simeon Bar Sabaye attended the council along with the priest Shahdost as representatives of Papa, Bishop of Seleucia Ctesiphon. By highlighting the Persian attendees of the council, these historiographies lend a local accent to their accounts of the council. An extended account of the Council of Nicaea cannot, of course, skip over central figures like Constantine, Alexander, and Arius. Yet as 5 of the historiographies demonstrate, there was room to emphasize the local connections to the council by discussing local ecclesiastical leaders. Through the apparent assent of such ecclesial figures to the council's decisions, the universal significance of the council was brought to a local context. Finally, the theology of the council. Most East Syriac historiographies emphasize the dispute between Arius and Alexander as the event that sparked the Council of Nicaea. Arius's condemnation by the council is likewise included in nearly all of them. This makes it perhaps somewhat surprising that the theology advocate that the council itself hardly surfaces. This, of course, has to do with the genre of these works. If we looked at other works by the same authors, we would find that they look at the theology in more detail. But to stick to the historiographies, we end up with a summary of 8 of them, like this. 5 of the 9 sources provide little to no information on the theology of the council. The fragment, the history of Karka de Beth Saloch, as well as Elias of Nisibis' chronicle, include no description of the council's theology as such. The Chronicle of Siirt notes that the synod came up with a creed that should be read at gatherings before the consecration. And it also refers to the canons of the council that the Church of the East shares with the Syriac Orthodox and the Chalcedonian churches. Amr similarly speaks of the creed in what was decreed by the council. 3 further sources offer short discussions of the theology either rejected or accepted by Nicaea. In his description of the events that precipitated Nicaea, Bar Hadbashaba attributes a number of views that he ascribes to Arius and other heretics. The Chronicle of Arbala likewise reports the false views held by Arius, but the Chronicle also notes positively that the 318, I quote, established that the Son, Christ, is of the same nature as his Father and equal to him in substance. Finally, Saliba mentions both the formula of faith and the canons, and includes a brief statement about Arius' false beliefs. The only historiography to provide a more detailed account of the theology opposed by and advocated for at Nicaea is John Bar Penkaye's History. After listing the names of 10 heretics, Bar Penkaye summarizes their teachings as follows. 1 was assaulting the Holy Spirit by making it less than the Father. Another was unsettling the Trinity. Another was denigrating God the Word as a creation. Another was proclaiming Christ as a mere human being. Another was saying that he did not take a body. Another was introducing something foreign whose wickedness is unspeakable. Another was saying that he took a body but not a soul. Another was putting forth that he took both of them without a mind. In the description of the council itself, so these are the heresies they said led up to the council, the history specifies the belief advocated at the council as follows. They proclaimed the truth of the faith in one divine being, acknowledged in 3 equal and distinct persons of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. They also explained the union of our firstfruits with God the Word. Bar Penkaye identifies the major theological accomplishments of the council as its contributions to the understanding of the Trinity and Christology. The lack of attention to theology in the historiographic writings of the Church of the East, examined in the preceding part of my talk, serves as a helpful point of departure to identify what this brief survey has shown and what it is not. First, the near absence of theological topics in this corpus seems less surprising when one considers the broader literary landscape in which they were written. Texts like the Synodicon Orientale grant far more attention to theological matters, as would be expected. Second, while Elias of Nisibis's chronicle only mentions Arius and Constantine, his theological treatise, the Book of the Demonstration of the Correctness of the Faith, mentions a much wider range of individuals, including East Syriac ecclesiastical figures. The historiographic sources at the center of my talk offer one specific lens on the reception of the Council of Nicaea. They show the importance attached to the Council, including the Church's self-understanding, as ecclesiastically tied to a council held in the Roman Empire. The theological debate and solution reverberated in the Church in Persia despite the different historical circumstances. The main actors at this council were known, yet the historiographers went to great pains to connect their own bishops to the council. Finally, the council was honored for its rebuttal of heresy and its contribution to Trinitarian theology and Christology. The broader relevance of East Syriac historiographic texts lies in their efforts to navigate between the universal and the particular, between the ecumenical church and the local instantiation thereof. In this anniversary year, the reception of the Council of Nicaea will be traced and discussed in many traditions. Its modern reception as a marker of shared Christian identity, as a major reference point for the relationship between church and state, and as the prime example for the role of synodal gatherings in shaping church doctrine, will be heavily discussed. The sources of the Church of the East offer an important, often neglected perspective on how one Christian community navigated its own relationship to this council, accepting its ecumenical, even authoritative character, but not letting go of its own ecclesiastical particularity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We are running late, but we still will take few questions. So, anyone has a question? Yes, there, please.
Yeah.